You have felt guilty for a thought no one heard. That reaction feels natural. It is not. In 1945, a sealed jar was found in the Egyptian desert near Jabal al-Tarif. Inside, a text that describes a God that does not create, but controls, not through force, but through belief. The disturbing part is not that this idea existed. It is how closely it matches something already operating inside you. There is a moment before you act where something decides what is allowed. You trust that voice without knowing where it came from. This video will show you how that structure forms, how it sustains itself, and why it feels like your own judgment. Because once you recognize the pattern, the question is no longer what you believe. It is who installed the limit. A text was not just forgotten. It was removed from circulation. Not because it lacked meaning, because it interfered with something already in place. The system that defines truth does not only preserve ideas, it filters them. Some are amplified. Some are ignored. A few are kept out entirely. That selection process is rarely visible. You inherit the result, not the decision. This is where the pattern begins to shift. If a description of God had to be excluded to maintain consistency, then belief is no longer just about faith. It becomes about structure. And structures do not disappear with time. They adapt. What was once enforced externally can become internal. Not as a rule you follow, but as a limit you stopped noticing. That is where this stops being historical and starts becoming operational. You have corrected a thought no one heard. You have felt guilt without a witness. Nothing changed outside you. No one reacted. No consequence followed. Still, something in you responded, as if a boundary had been crossed. You recognized it instantly and adjusted without hesitation. You called that conscience because that is the word you were given. That response feels natural because it has been repeated enough times to become automatic. You do not stop to question where it came from. You assume it belongs to you. The text found in Nag Hammadi introduces a distinction that most people never examine. Creation is one function. Authority is another. One brings something into existence. The other defines what that existence is allowed to become. Those two roles were not originally the same. At some point, they were merged into a single figure that represents both origin and control. That fusion removes the need to question authority, because it presents authority as the source of everything. You did not choose that structure. You received it already assembled. Before you could analyze it, it was already shaping how you interpret right and wrong, allowed and forbidden, acceptable and unacceptable. This is where the mechanism becomes visible. When authority is accepted as natural, it does not need to justify itself. It does not need to explain its limits. It only needs to remain unchallenged. And once it is internalized, it no longer appears as something imposed on you. It appears as your own judgment. This is how control moves from the outside to the inside. Not as something you follow, but something you enforce. The Apocryphon of John describes a figure called the Demiurge. It is not portrayed as a dramatic villain or an obvious force of oppression. It is described as something far more stable and difficult to detect. It is certain of its position, certain that it is the highest authority, certain that nothing exists beyond the boundaries it defines. That certainty is what makes the structure effective. A system that presents itself as complete does not need to eliminate alternatives through force. It only needs to establish its limits as absolute. Once those limits are accepted, anything outside them stops being considered. Inside that kind of structure, questioning does not feel necessary. In some cases, it feels inappropriate, not because someone is actively preventing you from asking, but because the question itself does not fully form. This pattern is not confined to ancient texts. It appears in everyday thinking. A belief that you have never tested can still feel stable. A rule you have never examined can still feel correct. The absence of doubt is interpreted as confirmation. It doesn't feel imposed. It feels inevitable. That is how systems sustain themselves without visible pressure. They begin as external frameworks, but over time they are repeated, reinforced, and internalized. What was once instruction becomes assumption. What was once learned becomes automatic. At that point, the structure no longer needs to present itself as authority. It is no longer something you follow. It becomes something you use. And when that happens, control does not appear as control. It appears as your own judgment. If authority can exist without being verified, then obedience no longer depends on truth. It depends on continuity. A pattern that repeats itself over time begins to lose its visibility. It stops standing out. It becomes part of the background of how you think and interpret the world. The text does not try to remove belief. It shows how belief functions within a system. Once something is accepted as complete, it no longer needs to justify itself. It does not need to explain its origin or defend its limits. It only needs to remain consistent enough to avoid disruption. This is where the shift becomes structural. You are not standing outside the system and evaluating it. You are moving within it, using its assumptions as your starting point. That position makes questioning less likely because there is no clear boundary between the system and your own reasoning. This condition rarely produces tension. It produces stability. And stability is often mistaken for truth. If something feels steady and predictable, it is assumed to be reliable. That assumption creates a loop. When a system feels stable, you begin to trust it. Once you trust it, you stop testing it. When you stop testing it, it continues to feel stable. At no point in that sequence is truth required. The system sustains itself through repetition and acceptance, not through verification. The text introduces a claim that can be easily missed because it does not present itself as dramatic. It states that the human being was formed without full awareness. Something essential was absent at the beginning. Then something was introduced later, a form of insight that did not originate from the same source that produced the body. This detail creates a structural fracture. If awareness comes from outside the system that defines authority, then that authority does not fully comprehend what it governs. It can regulate behavior. It can establish limits, but it does not generate the capacity to observe those limits. That difference matters. You can follow rules without understanding them. You can behave in ways that appear correct without knowing the reason behind them. That kind of alignment does not require awareness. It only requires repetition and reinforcement. Awareness operates differently. It does not simply follow the rule. It notices the existence of the rule. It can examine where it came from, how it functions, and whether it should continue to apply. This is where the rupture begins at a personal level. The moment a structure is observed, it stops being completely transparent. It becomes something that can be evaluated rather than something that simply operates. Once that happens, the system loses a degree of its automatic influence. It may still be present. It may still shape behavior. But it no longer does so without being seen. A system that depends on acceptance without verification does not require constant external enforcement. It needs to be installed in a way that allows it to operate on its own. That is the mechanism at work. In the text, the demiurge does not control through continuous intervention. It establishes a framework that defines what is real, what is permitted, and what does not enter consideration at all. Once that framework is accepted, the system no longer needs to assert itself. It becomes the reference point through which everything is interpreted. The same pattern appears in ordinary behavior. There are thoughts that begin to form and are interrupted before they are fully expressed. There are actions that are avoided without a clear explanation. In those moments, there is no visible authority directing the response. Pay attention the next time a thought stops halfway, not after you correct it. At the exact moment it disappears. The adjustment happens automatically. It does not feel like obedience. It feels like preference or caution. This is the result of internalization. What was once external instruction has been repeated and reinforced until it functions from within. The system no longer needs to tell you what to do. It defines the range of what feels acceptable to do. That range becomes the boundary of action. It is rarely examined because it does not present itself as a limitation. It presents itself as possibility. And what feels possible is almost never questioned. There is a brief moment after you wake up when nothing has been decided yet. No input has entered your attention. No structure has fully taken hold. It is a narrow interval where your mind is present without direction. Then a sequence begins. You reach for something. You check a screen. You follow a familiar order of actions that feels already established. The shift happens quickly and without resistance. It does not feel imposed. It feels inevitable. That transition is easy to overlook because it does not create friction. It blends into routine. The same pattern appears in smaller moments throughout the day. You pause before expressing a thought that would not create any real consequence. You adjust how you speak even when no one is listening. You allow certain ideas to fade before they are fully formed. These responses do not feel like decisions. They happen before a decision is consciously made. They are pre-configured. Repeated patterns that have been reinforced to the point where they operate automatically. The system does not wait for you to act. It defines what feels possible before action begins. At that point, control no longer looks like control. It feels like your own choice. And that is why it is never questioned. The brain is not organized to prioritize truth above all else. Its primary function is to reduce uncertainty and maintain stability. When faced with multiple interpretations, it tends to favor the one that requires the least effort to sustain. Predictable patterns are easier to process. They demand less energy and allow faster decisions. An interpretation that has been repeated becomes easier to access and easier to defend, even if it is incomplete or inaccurate. This is not abstract. It can be observed in how decisions are made. A familiar explanation is accepted quickly. A stable framework is maintained without much resistance. The mind prefers continuity over disruption. The structure described in the text aligns with this tendency. When an authority appears consistent, the brain interprets that consistency as reliability. Once something is treated as reliable, it is no longer examined with the same level of attention. This creates a feedback loop. The system feels correct because it is not questioned. It is not questioned because it feels correct. The absence of doubt is interpreted as confirmation. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. The process no longer requires active choice. You are not evaluating each belief as it appears. You are maintaining a structure that is already in place. This is how influence becomes internal. What begins as external input is repeated, reinforced, and stabilized until it functions as a self-sustaining system. If a system can define what feels natural, then perception is no longer neutral. It becomes conditioned. What appears immediate and self-evident is shaped before you even notice it. This creates a specific problem. You cannot rely on discomfort as a signal that something is wrong, and you cannot rely on comfort as a signal that something is true. Both reactions can be generated by the same structure. A belief can feel stable simply because it has been repeated long enough. A restriction can feel appropriate simply because it has never been examined. This removes a common point of reference. You are not engaging with reality directly. You are engaging with a version that has already been filtered before you had the chance to question it. The filter does not present itself as a filter. It presents itself as your own perception. At that stage, the question begins to change. It is no longer about identifying what is true or false in isolation. It becomes about understanding what has shaped your sense of what feels true. That question is difficult to resolve because the tools you would normally use to answer it are part of the same system. The process of evaluation is influenced by the structure it is trying to examine. This makes the boundary between observation and conditioning harder to detect. Early Gnostic texts do not describe a single act of deception. They describe a layered structure. In the Apocryphon of John, the demiurge does not operate in isolation. It exists within a hierarchy of forces, each one reinforcing the limits established by the others. This creates a recursive system. Each layer supports the one above it, and each boundary feels complete from within. There is no obvious edge because every level confirms the next. From the inside, the structure appears final. This pattern is not limited to ancient cosmology. Closed systems follow the same logic. A belief is supported by other beliefs. A rule is justified by other rules. Each element refers back to something already accepted, and that repetition creates stability. Over time, the system becomes self-referential. It no longer depends on external validation because it produces its own confirmation. Everything within it agrees with everything else, and that agreement is interpreted as proof. The same structure can be observed in personal identity. You describe yourself using concepts you did not create. Those concepts connect and reinforce one another until they form a coherent image. That coherence feels reliable. It gives the impression of accuracy. But coherence only indicates that the parts fit together. it does not guarantee that they correspond to something true. The figure described in the text does not need to be understood as a literal being in order to have meaning. It can be understood as a function, a boundary that defines where inquiry stops, a point at which questioning no longer continues. This boundary does not announce itself. It operates quietly by shaping what is considered valid to think about and what never fully takes form. When that limit is accepted, everything beyond it becomes inaccessible by default, not because it cannot exist, but because it is not permitted within the structure that defines what is acceptable. This changes how the idea of God operates. It is no longer only a point of origin. It becomes a filter, a structure that determines which questions can be asked and which ones remain incomplete before they are even expressed. You were not trained to detect that filter. You were trained to respect it. Respect reinforces the boundary without requiring force. It creates consistency and predictability. That consistency produces stability, but it also creates containment. The system remains intact because its limits are maintained from within, not imposed from outside. The jar found near Nag Hammadi did not introduce a new belief. It revealed a structure that was already in place. A system can define authority, limit inquiry, and sustain itself through repetition. Once that system becomes internal, it no longer depends on constant enforcement. That is the part that remains. The texts were buried, but the pattern continued. It moved through time without interruption because it no longer depended on visibility. It operated through what felt normal. You still move through structures that define what feels acceptable, what feels dangerous, and what never fully becomes a thought. Most of these responses occur without resistance, not because they are correct, but because they are familiar. The discovery in 1945 did not alter that system. It made its outline visible. It showed that what appears natural can be constructed, and what feels internal can originate from something external. What happens next depends on recognition. If the structure is not seen, it continues to operate without interruption. If it is seen, it does not disappear. It remains present, but it no longer functions in the same way. Visibility changes the relationship. It creates a distance between the structure and the one who observes it. That distance does not replace belief with another belief. It changes the position from which belief is held. What remains is a question that does not resolve on its own. It does not offer a conclusion. It redirects attention. What in your thinking feels natural only because it has never been examined? If nothing in this felt familiar, then it changes nothing. But if even one part felt too precise to ignore, then the system is no longer invisible. And that creates a different kind of problem. Because once you see a limit, you can't pretend it's not there. You don't have to resolve it. But if you felt that moment where something shifted slightly out of place, I'm curious what that was. Not your conclusion. Just the point where it stopped feeling automatic.